Well, hello again. Welcome to Horror in Detail. Today we are going to share Wendigo encounter stories. First story, The Cult in the Woods. So there's this story about these woods in a place near where I'm visiting. I'm in a small town in Alabama visiting family. There is an entrance and two clearings in a forest near my house. Back a few years ago, my friend Tyler and I heard a story about this little girl being murdered. I had a hard time believing that. Well, the 9 and 11-year-old Tyler and I went into the woods. We saw two clearings. One was full of tire rims and bricks. The other was relatively clean for a forest. It smelled like roses. We were walking back and it got dark. Before I continue, let me give you a backstory. There was a man and his daughter who went into the forest. The man told his daughter to wait where the second clearing was. He came back, but hitting her with a car, killing her. Where the first clearing closest to the road is where he stopped and committed suicide. When it got dark, Tyler and I had stopped. We felt painful scratching at our ankles and shins. We ran as fast as our 9 and 11-year-old legs would let us go. Wood's cabin when we got home. Tyler went to his grandpa's house, which was right next door. We went to sleep after texting about that for an hour after that. We woke up, went out by the fence, talked, and played Monster Hunter Freedom Unite on our PSPs. After we hung out, we told each other we would never go back there again. But now I'm 14 and Tyler is 16. I'm still as dumb. So, of course, I went back there. So, as I was going through the clearings, I smelled the faint aroma of roses in the last clearing. I decided that this was enough, so I started walking back. I noticed something that I didn't notice when I was first walking in. A cabin-like structure. It filled me with a fear I'd never felt before. When curiosity fell over me, I walked over. The crunching leaves and sticks felt like it added to the surreal feeling that shrouded me. I went and looked at the cabin. I noticed one of the tire rims from a few years back. It was nailed to a small, skinny tree. Wood's tire rim, I was getting anxious, so I ran as fast as I could. I'm glad I ran as a sprinter on the track team, haha. I ran not only as I was terrified of the building, but the dark red robe I saw in the distance. A lot of the tree tops started rustling, and that's what motivated me to get my ass out of there. After I left, I made a note with a crimson handprint. I wrote, "We know." A pretty crappy Elder Scrolls reference, I know. After 3 days, I went back and nailed the note to another skinny tree near the cabin. Then I waited 2 weeks. I came back after the wait. When I was trekking through, I almost activated something. It was a tripwire. There were 2 beer bottles tied to it, a brown one and a white one. I went to investigate the place when I saw they built more things and that the note I left was gone. I took some pictures and ran as I felt anxious again. Later that night, I was having a hard time sleeping, even though I was sharing a room with my 21-year-old brother who helps with the babies. Later, at around 2 o'clock in the morning, I looked outside. There were 2 people walking down the street. The street light illuminated the 2 people. I nearly yelled when I saw something that scared the living hell out of me. 2 red robes. Second story. Wendigo or something else? I've posted a story about this before, and I'll copy it in this, but I really want to know what's going on in the woods. I thought it was a Wendigo, but now I'll share my new experience after the old. I live in a small town in the country. There are more cows than people, and some of the buildings are really old. This happened when I was about 8 years old, and this is the first time I've brought myself to tell this story, and I only have the courage because I'm far away from the trees. I lived in a valley, and the woods surrounded our house on all sides. Now, my entire family has lived in these valleys and hills for generations, and there are countless stories of paranormal things happening to all of us. Several strange things have happened to me, but this is one of the most terrifying. So, living in a small town in the middle of nowhere, there wasn't really anything to do other than hike. I loved hiking and would repeatedly walk in the woods for hours. There was an old story that my great-grandmother told me of a creature that lived in the woods and would stalk anyone who entered. As a kid, I thought, "You're right, it was probably just a trick of the trees or something." But this day, I stayed out a little later than I intended to, and it started getting dark. Turning back, I began to walk towards my house when I heard a noise behind me. It wasn't uncommon to see a chipmunk or a bird, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. Shrugging it off, I continued, but the sounds got louder and louder. You could hear the leaves rustle and the branches snap behind me. I began to get scared. You always hear those stories of kids being kidnapped because they're alone, so I began to run. Not the smartest because I tripped over a branch and fell, skinning my knee pretty bad. Turning around quickly, I thought I was done for, but there was nothing behind me, just trees and leaves. It was dead quiet. Even the wind wasn't rustling the leaves, and there wasn't a single bird singing. Feeling pretty silly, I got up, brushed myself off, and turned to walk the rest of the way home when I saw it. To this day, I don't know what it was. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a deer. I live in the country, and I know what they look like. This thing was in the distance staring at me. It was covered in fur and had these piercing white eyes, and what looked like horns or antlers were protruding from its head. It knew I saw it because it smiled, and I swear all of its teeth were sharp fangs. I instantly wanted to scream and run, but when I looked into its eyes, I was frozen. I couldn't even blink, let alone scream. I could only stand there dumbly as it got closer and closer. The closer it got, the more bony it looked. Its limbs were long, and it looked starved. It stank like rotting flesh, and I felt like crying, but I couldn't. I honestly thought I was done for until it stopped. Its head tilted, and it just looked at me, then turned and walked away. When it left, I could move again, and when I thought I could walk without falling, I ran home. I shut myself in my room and bawled my eyes out for hours. I didn't go back in the woods for years, and even now I'm weary of it. I don't know what it was or why it was there, but I got the message loud and clear: stay away. That happened well over 10 years ago and was really the only major experience I had in the woods. Until recently. Now, growing up, I've seen more strange things in the woods than I can count. But most of them aren't anything to be concerned with. Except recently, something dark has been moving in the woods. It looks like a man sometimes, but will change shape. It ducks in between trees and hides just on the edge of where the woods are. I thought I was crazy, but my close friends have seen it too. This thing seems to give off an evil feeling. One of my friends were pushed down the hill and swears that she saw this dark entity out of the corner of her eye when it happened. Another of my friends swears they heard laughter coming from the trees. This thing gives me the creeps. I'm not sure if this shadow man is the same creature that I thought was a Wendigo or not, but it definitely isn't friendly. Does anyone have any idea what this thing is? Is it the Wendigo, or are they two different entities? Third story. It came over the fence. Okay, so hi. I was the person to post, I think it lives in the fields. This did not occur too long ago, but recent conversations with a family member have provoked further thoughts. My grandmother has told me my whole life that there used to be mountain lions or cougars in our area. It used to be swamp and dense forest. Now it's mostly fields and chunks of forest scattered about. She said her own grandmother had barely got away from a big cat by throwing her clothes off, knowing the animal would stop and smell each one and give her time to run. She said this was a safe way to escape an animal that relies on smell, especially a big cat. Anyways, my grandma's birthday party was a few days ago. We celebrated and had fun. There was barbecue, some cake. My younger cousins and I played games outside until around sunset when my aunt yelled at us all to come in, or the mosquitoes will carry you away. So we sat in a small room near the front door, which had 4 clear window panes surrounded by some colored ones. The door had some light still coming through it, which shone light on the walls, which was kind of pretty. As we settled, we played some card games and watched YouTube. I listened to my parents talk and then waited for the conversation to get interesting. They usually did this at gatherings when the kids were not within earshot. I started to hear them hush and then silence. For a loud family, this was weird. Hearing them go dead silent kind of made my heart pick up its pace. It was like when a teacher silences a group of whispering kids. It was quick and kind of scary. I left my cousins to watch the PewDiePie video they were watching and go to the living room. To understand, imagine a rectangle standing vertically. The bottom holds a small room open across from a bathroom. These set above a bedroom. Past that is an open kitchen and dining room and living room. The kitchen on bottom and the dining room between that and the living room. Past that is another room, and to the right of the living room is another room. Sealed off. It used to be my grandfather's airplane room. He built models in there before he died. I walked past all the food, and since it was an open space, my mom and aunt watched me creep up behind everyone. This house creaked with every step, so it did not matter if they saw me. Sitting and staring out the large, ceiling-to-floor windows at the front yard. The front yard is to the left of the living room on our rectangle. It was just after sunset, and the clouds were still somewhat lit up with a dark blue and pale purple tone. The clouds were thick because we had a storm coming, but we were not looking at that. We were staring at the weird-looking big cat sitting along the fence that IT was hunched and looked thin and honestly like it was sick and decaying. But it looked like it had a long face and what looked like limbs. My 2 uncles and my dad quietly talked about getting the guns. We stared for a while until my cousins started calling and running out of the room as they had seen it through their window on the front door. At that time, 2 of my uncles got up looking for guns just in case. My aunt and my mom started to lock windows and close other rooms off from the house in case it decided to try and smash in somehow. They had the kids in the shop where my grandpa used to work. My dad, being unable to do heavy lifting and fast movement because of a prosthetic leg. So he dialed animal control phone number, with everyone looking away except for me and my grandmother. We saw it stand up like a human, but hunched. The cat-like thing leaned against the fence, and then hopped over it. We thought it was outside the yard. It was in 10 or 20 minutes before we saw it. My younger cousins and I were playing near that spot. I went to my grandmother's side, and she held my hand. The cat thing wasn't a cat. After watching so many videos and reading so many articles, I think it was a Wendigo, but with a different animal form. The scary part was its eyes weren't glowing any color, but they were illuminated, and they were milky gray. It was terrifying. Thankfully, no one was hurt. We haven't seen it since. 9 out of 10. Okay, I've edited this so it's better to read. Thanks to the person who told me it was shit to read. 4th story. What was it really? What really attacked our horses? My sister and I took a ride on our horses a few days ago, and I would say our horses are fairly spooked, Professor. They sit still when we shoot rifles off their backs, so when they got spooked at a tall, dark, twisted figure in the corner of the woods, we flipped out and booked it back to the barn. We rode them straight into the barn, sucking down, so we wouldn't get knocked off. They ran straight into their stalls. My sister was in a separate stall opposite me with her horse. We locked the stalls and bolted the doors shut from the inside. This was a feature I never thought we would need. Dead bolts on the inside of a stall, and with window covers there was no way inside. I heard it chase us. Whatever it was had been following us closely through the field. I think we barely escaped. I didn't even notice my horse was bleeding on her left hip. I felt her kick while we were riding away, but I didn't think something had actually got her. She was sweaty, and I could see the white in her eyes. I stood away from the window and the door. My father must have seen us, or because we heard gunshots coming from the right side of the barn going towards the field. I called out to Sherry, not her real name, asking if she was okay. She was, but her horse was hurt just like mine. She asked if I saw what it was that scared the horses. I told her I barely saw anything. To be honest, I still don't know what it was. But it was thin and dark and smelled rotten. It left claw marks deep in our horseback sides. They'll have matching scars, but I don't think they'll let us take them back to the woods. They haven't left their stalls for 2 days. My dad described it as a really mutated and mangled dog. He shot at it. When it started to run into the barn, he made it bleed, but we haven't found the body. To be fair, he was pretty far away from it, so he didn't see it really good. What is it? I've heard of skinwalkers and Wendigos, so I thought I'd post my story and ask. We have no clue to this day, but it always comes back at the end of every month without fail and kills our livestock. It hasn't come this close to us before, but now it's become a scary problem. Any help would be appreciated. I'll update soon. It should be back, and my brothers are going to kill it this time. 5th story. I know what really killed the old western town of Calico. It came from the mines. My grandfather told me a horrifying story about something that happened in the town of Calico during the dying days of the Wild West. I finally summoned the courage to tell this tale to my grandson, and he insisted that I share it here. I'm not sure that the young boy fully believes me, but he never knew my grandfather. That man was many things, but he did not lie. He could not lie. My name is Elizabeth Langley. I am 82 years old, and I have lived in England for my entire life. I remember when I was about 8 years old, asking my father about his home. He had a faint American accent, so I knew he had not always lived here. Oakley, California, my father answered. What a place. I miss it. Still, I wouldn't have met your mother if I hadn't moved to England. Why did you move here? Was it the war? I asked. I had always fantasized about America. I longed for the sun-drenched land of California, rather than the bleak remnants of a post-war London. This would have been the year of 1948. I was only a young boy. I must have been no more than 13 years of age when my father packed our bags. As you know, he's a complicated man. He never told me why we were moving. He just said he couldn't do it anymore, my father explained. My curiosity had been piqued. I had expected a simple answer, but my father had only left me with more questions. I knew I had to talk to my grandfather. I had to know more about what happened in America. I think in hindsight, I would have preferred to live my life without this tale rattling around at the back of my mind. Whether you read ahead is your choice. It's not a story for children, my grandfather told me. Every Christmas, he would come to stay with us. Every Christmas, I pleaded with him to tell me about America. It wasn't until I turned 12 that he finally caved. He realized that I would never stop pestering him, I suppose. My grandfather, Harley, met my grandmother in San Francisco, and they moved to Oakley when my father was born. That didn't answer my question, though. What was so wrong with America? Why did they move to England? There was nothing wrong with Oakley, the dear old man explained to me. There had been nothing wrong with San Francisco, either. What haunted my grandfather was the life he had left behind. He had tried, for years, to flee from it. Nowhere was far enough. Even as he told me this tale, he admitted that traveling to England had never offered the respite he so desperately sought. He said that perhaps it was finally time he told somebody his story and lessened the burden. Before moving to San Francisco in 1896, my grandfather had been a prospector. He left home at the age of 16, moved from town to town, and eventually settled in Calico, California. Most Americans have probably heard of this western ghost town. But for those readers who don't know about it, the official story about this boom-in-bust town is that minerals dwindled, as they did in many western towns. The mines dried up, people moved away. However, Harley always insisted that something else happened in Calico. There was another reason that the townsfolk disappeared. It all started in 1895. My grandfather had already been living in Calico for 3 years. He had become a part of the community. He saw himself as more than a prospector. He had even considered settling there. There were a few handsome women in town that he said he would have considered marrying. He had plenty of friends. He enjoyed a drink or two in the saloon. What more could he want from life? Silver was already starting to lose its value, but my grandfather didn't care. He was only 21 years old in the year of 1895, but he was tired. He wanted more from life than mining for valuable resources. And he believed Calico could become more than a mining town. The silver rush didn't have to be the end of it. He believed it could be a place that people would call home. Obviously, that's not how things turned out, but Harley swore that the end of mining was not the thing that killed Calico. In December of 1895, things began to change in the town. People started to go missing. Any search efforts were half-hearted, unfortunately, as the icy nights deterred most people from exerting their full efforts. They wanted to stay indoors. Harley said that a prospector named Lester Grant talked of something he had found down in the mines. A new mineral, something that would save the mine and, in turn, the people of Calico. Apparently, the prospector claimed it was something he'd never seen before. Perhaps it was even more valuable than silver. My grandfather and his friend laughed it off. They knew, as did everybody in the saloon, that Lester was a drunkard. He was always spouting nonsense to lighten the mood. Lester, as you might have guessed, was the first person to vanish without a trace. Others soon followed. All sorts of townsfolk, miners, barbers, bartenders, and even one of the sheriff's deputies. That's when things became more serious. 12 people went missing in the first week. When the sheriff's deputy became the 13th to vanish, that's when the search parties became a little more frantic. One evening, when Sheriff Harper was drinking with Harley and his friends in the saloon, he urged them to not let word spread about the disappearances. He didn't want any outside law enforcement to get involved. The sheriff claimed it was just life on the frontier. There were so many possible explanations. Coyotes, bandits, people smelling the end of the silver rush, perhaps. My grandfather wanted to favor the latter suggestion. Everybody favored that suggestion. It was better to assume that townsfolk had simply moved away, rather than assuming some harm had come to them. Still, Harley was a wise man, and he could not quite shake the feeling that nobody had left Calico. He couldn't stop thinking about what Lester had said. Harley continued to raise the issue in the saloon, night after night. James implored his friend to stop. He needed the mine. He needed the town. Like most people, James was too fixated on the dying days of the frontier to notice anything else. Another week later, after the total number of disappearances totaled 19 people, my grandfather's nightly saloon talk was interrupted. Martha, the bartender, finished her shift and joined Harley and his friends at their table. They immediately offered their condolences. A few days prior, Martha's sister had gone missing. My grandfather said that the bartender's haunted disposition filled him with great unease. She looked not like somebody in the throes of grief, but somebody with a terrible secret. Still, Martha did not stall. She did not mince her words. She said that she had seen her sister. One of the men at the table excitedly roared that they must notify the sheriff. Martha explained that the man did not understand. The previous night, she stood at her upstairs window and gazed out onto the sandy main road that ran through Calico. There, gazing up at her, was her sister. Only it wasn't her sister. Not really. It was something in her sister's yellow sundress. My grandfather could remember exactly how Martha described the figure. I, too, can remember the exact wording. She painted a nightmarish picture that is permanently etched into my mind. I could scarcely see her in the moonlight, Martha said. My joy was fleeting. I soon realized that she had no discernible facial features. Just a mouth, a gaping mouth black as the night. She was emaciated, yet so much taller than I remember. Her dress was torn. I could see so little of her, but I could hear her. Didn't you hear that sound last night? It was an inhuman, whistling scream. It sounded like an animal calling to the pack. Of course, most of the men at the table dismissed Martha, claiming that grief had driven her to lunacy. They hadn't heard a scream. They might have heard a few animals, but they heard no inhuman screams. My grandfather said that James simply looked at him with a pale expression. He whispered to Harley that he had heard a blood-curdling scream during the night. He thought he had been dreaming because it was a sound no human could produce, and it was certainly like no animal he had ever encountered. Harley told his friend that he knew who could help. The next morning, he and James did not join their friends in the mines. They traveled southeast, searching for a small tribe of Native Americans that lived towards the town of Yermo. Harley knew a woman named Anjani, one of the elders. Over the years, he had sold various minerals to her from his prospecting ventures in local towns. My grandfather explained to James that Anjani had told him stories of a terrifying creature, the Wendigo. Martha's sister did not match that description, but the encounter sounded like something beyond the realm of logical explanation. The elder had once told my grandfather that there were things which the white colonizers did not understand. If there were anyone who could explain what Martha saw, Harley swore it would be her. When the two men arrived at the tribal village, my grandfather said that Anjani was already expecting him. She told him that something had been unearthed in Calico. It was an ancient thing that should have been left alone. My grandfather said that 3 years earlier, the old woman cautioned him against prospecting in Calico. She said that land was fragile. Dark things lay there, and those dark things should not have been disturbed. Apparently, James looked even paler than the night before. My grandfather kept encouraging him to drink some water because he didn't want his friend to pass out on the journey back to Calico. And Harley wasn't finished. He needed to know more. He begged Anjani to tell him what was happening to the people of Calico. My grandfather said the elder was far more terrified about this creature than any of the others she had discussed. She said one word, Daiba. It is a creature worse than the Wendigo, she explained to my grandfather. There is a nameless force deep in the earth that calls out to desperate people. It calls to those who need something, much like the residents of Calico, who face the extinction of their livelihoods. Harley inferred that Lester must have felt this force calling to him. There had never been a magical mineral in the mine that would solve all of their problems. Everybody in Calico wanted more. The force must have been calling to all of them. How long? My grandfather wondered. Would it be before everyone was gone? Anjani explained that the thirst cannot be quenched until the victim has become a Daiba. Then, their mortal desires fade away. Instead, they thirst only for souls, draining the flesh and the spirit of all those who cross their path. The elder said it is a fate worse than death. When the soul is drained, the victim is denied passage to the afterlife. My grandfather heeded her warning and dragged James back out to the horses, preparing to race back to Calico. Before he could leave, however, Anjani grabbed my grandfather's wrist and whispered into his ear. She told him that James had the thirst. She could see it. She begged Harley not to follow his friend into the mines. Harley did not reply. He said James smiled weakly at him before kicking his stirrups and commencing the ride back to Calico. My grandfather did not want to believe it. He couldn't believe it. He wanted to save his friend, but he couldn't lie to himself. He knew that James was already gone. His friend had heard the call of whatever sinister force lay deep in the earth, and his thirst would not be quenched until that call had been answered. As the pair rode back to town, the sun began to set on the horizon. My grandfather said that he felt apprehended by the sudden emergence of Calico on the horizon. Uncharacteristically for that time of night, there was not a single visible light. The town had been engulfed by the night. There was no light, no movement, and no sound. The two men unsaddled themselves and tied their horses to a post. James was shivering at this point, and my grandfather was starting to worry about him. He dipped his head over the doors to the local saloon, peering into the empty building. Nothing. Not a light. Not a sound. Not a person in sight. My grandfather told James that they needed to go straight to the sheriff. Keeping James in his line of sight, Harley led them across the isolated town. When they reached the sheriff's office, they were met with an open doorway. It led into blackness, but there was a kerosene lamp perched on a table in the center of the room. With great trepidation, my grandfather took a few cautious steps inside and called out for the sheriff. There was no response. He tiptoed towards the table in the center of the room, picked up the kerosene lamp, and spun in a circle to get his bearings. What my grandfather said he saw next is something that still chills me to the bone, so I have no idea how horrified he must have felt. It was the sheriff. He was not one of the Daiba. He was not anything. The corpse lay on the hard floor, barely visible in the dim light of my grandfather's lamp. The man was a shell. That's how his corpse was described to me. It had been, much as Anjani said, drained both in flesh and spirit. The sheriff had been reduced to little more than bones with bloody strips of flesh remaining. My grandfather said the skull was the worst part of the scene. The sheriff's skin was mostly intact, though gray and colorless, but his eye sockets were empty, and his skull was split roughly down the middle. Harley vomited. I'm not quite sure how he managed to hold his stomach as long as he did, but perhaps, despite his lengthy, detailed description, the whole ordeal only lasted a matter of seconds. Who knows? I did not want to press him on the matter. I was happy for him to move forwards with the story, though things only worsened. When my grandfather left the sheriff's office, James had vanished, much like the rest of the town. Harley called for his friend, but Calico was silent. Nobody responded, not wanting to leave his loved ones behind, but understanding that the battle had already been lost. My dear old grandfather accepted defeat and began walking back to his horse, preparing to leave Calico behind. He untied his ticket out of that hellhole, mounted the saddle, and then looked back at the town. I still remember my grandfather's face as he reached this part of the story. The sheer horror. He asked me whether we could abandon the tale there. He said I could simply accept that he left Calico, and surely there was enough. But it wasn't. I had to know. I just had to know. There was a whistling scream. I did not need my grandfather to say any more than that. I knew it was the same as the one that both James and Martha had described. That's when my grandfather saw her. Martha! She burst through the saloon doors and sprinted onto the main road, tripping and falling. Presumably, she had been hiding in the building. My grandfather certainly didn't see her when he peered his head inside earlier, but he definitely saw her as she scrambled across the road on her hands and knees. And he saw the creature that followed her from the saloon, ducking as it slinked through the doorway. The Daiba. This one was larger and ghastlier than the sister that Martha had described. From its nondescript shirt and ragged trousers, Harley could not identify which missing town member was stalking the bartender. He said he hardly had time to assess the scene. It was over before it started. The once human creature used its spider-like limbs to move at great speed towards its prey. Moonlight sufficiently illuminated the scene of horror that unfolded before my grandfather. The Daiba lunged for Martha with one of the gnarly appendages that used to be its left hand, and it seized her by the throat. My grandfather said the bartender screeched at the top of her lungs, scratching at the Daiba's left hand with both of hers, and furiously swinging both of her legs back and forth. It was a fruitless endeavor. Harley knew he should avert his gaze. He knew he should ride away and never look back, but he could not peel his eyes from the scene before him. Raising her off the ground, the Daiba moved its right hand towards Martha's face. Suddenly, my grandfather understood what he had seen in the sheriff's office, and he understood what he was about to see. The creature formed a claw shape with its right hand and violently forced its thumb into Martha's right eye socket. My grandfather sobbed profusely as he told me this part of the tale. He said he had never felt so utterly helpless as he did when he watched one of his dearest friends suffer so slowly and agonizingly. Martha's screams grew in volume and ferocity. Harley watched as the creature suspended her in the air with the thumb that had pierced her right eye and released her neck with its left hand. Then, without pause, the Daiba plunged its left thumb into her left eye socket. My grandfather assured me that Martha's screaming rivaled that of the Daiba. It was almost as horrific. Almost. Lifting her body higher into the air, as if she were a trophy, the creature started to yank its hands outwards. Its thumbs were firmly lodged into the bloody sockets that had once been Martha's eyes. Her screeching grew to an unbearable volume. With an almighty tearing noise, the awful sound of Martha's agony ceased. The Daiba stared longingly at the corpse it held in its two hands, and then it began to drink from the canyon it had formed between the two halves of Martha's skull. My grandfather said he uttered a sound. It was involuntary. He had managed to resist the urge to cry or scream, but at this moment he gasped. The creature stopped. It turned to face Harley, and that was when it started. What followed was a cacophony of whistling screams. They echoed across the town. Soon, creatures began to reveal themselves from the nooks and crannies of Calico. One of them was wearing a yellow sundress. My grandfather distinctly remembered her. I'm not sure how he made it to his horse, given that everyone else perished. Perhaps the Daiba had been busy feeding when my grandfather first strolled through the town. Perhaps he had been fortunate enough to avoid them. Whatever the case, his luck had run out. His horse had been whinnying uncontrollably since he mounted it, possibly only standing still for so long because it was frozen in the same state of fear as my grandfather. At this point, Harley said his stallion seemed only too happy to oblige when he pulled at its reins and steered towards the road that led out of town. There was, of course, one last demon for my dear old grandfather to face before he could leave Calico behind for good. One last creature stood in the middle of the road to freedom. James. My grandfather said he was not surprised to see the gaping black hole of a mouth and those monstrous limbs, but that didn't make it any less painful to witness. Goodbye, old friend. Those were Harley's final words to James as he plowed onwards, head buried in his horse's mane of hair, charging towards his old friend and preparing for the cold embrace of death. And yet it didn't come. When my grandfather opened his eyes, he was free. His horse had galloped far beyond the boundaries of Calico. Harley looked over his shoulder to see his old friend standing at the side of the road. He had stepped aside to let my grandfather pass. Perhaps James was not quite as far gone as the others. Perhaps he had retained enough of his humanity to resist the thirst just a little longer. Whatever the case, my grandfather survived to tell the horrible tale. Before moving to San Francisco in 1896, he said he traveled back to Yermo to see Anjani, though he steered clear of Calico. The elders said that some of the Calico townsfolk had survived that unspeakable night by fleeing to the hills. She told my grandfather that the Daiba were not seen again. The tribe assumed that the creatures perished, given that they require continuous sustenance. Once the remaining townsfolk fled, the unnatural beings had no way to quench their thirst. They surely perished. That was the prevailing hypothesis. Other than the few Calico survivors and the people of Anjani's tribe, nobody ever learned of what happened in that town. In fact, Calico lasted for another decade. My grandfather explained that many of the townsfolk returned and tried to squeeze the last few drops of life out of the town before it was officially abandoned in 1907. Sometimes I wonder whether it was abandoned because the creatures returned. Perhaps some of the fools came back because they thirsted for something. Maybe the mines called to them. Sixth story. Extremely tall entity in El Dorado County, California. My wife and I were driving down a very windy road at about 10 p.m. after dropping a friend off. It's a very wooded area and properties are spread pretty far apart. This happened during the full moon in early February. It's very dark and secluded up there, but there was moonlight. While approaching the sharpest turn in the road, I began slowing down to approach the almost 180-degree turn in the road. There were no homes nearby here, just a gate entrance to someone's unkempt wooded property. I noticed while talking with my wife something moving across the road up ahead where the turn was to be made. My first thought was it was dust from a car that had made the turn ahead of us, but that made no sense because we were the only ones on the road up and again back down. What I saw was upwards of 20 feet, possibly even 30 feet tall, very skinny, and had kind of a bronze luminescence of its own. I thought it was dust in my headlights ahead, but it formed into a massively tall, slender, almost oval shape as it passed over the road. And as it got to the roadside and entered the tree line, heading up the mountainside, I realized a very large, skinny leg stepped forth from the shape and stepped into the woods. It almost looked like golden smoke, but with a certain shape and density to it. Needless to say, as soon as I realized I was witnessing something very unnatural, I started to say, "Did you see that?" And my wife cut me off to say, "You saw it too?" All of my hairs stood up, and I could feel the charge in the air of intense energy, even with the windows up and the heater on. I became very afraid and kept driving down the mountain because I knew we had both just witnessed something we probably should have not. I pulled off of the road about a half a mile away to discuss, specifically, what we had just seen. Our descriptions matched to a T. I had had a very negative paranormal experience as a teenager, so when she enthusiastically demanded we go back, I was very hesitant. But finally curiosity got the best of me, and we returned to the place we saw this thing. I'm still not sure if what I saw was cryptid or alien or some type of spirit, but I can say it was inhuman, and its sheer size made it very frightening. I parked in the road with my headlights shining up the hillside in the direction it was traveling, but nothing was there. We stood in the dark for about 15 minutes with the truck off, snapping photos and videos, but captured nothing unusual. I'm very interested to hear what anyone's theory on what this could have possibly been. Seventh story. The rules of our woods. The path through the woods is so twisted and winding that it doubles back at some points, and at others you could cut out 5 minutes of walking if you were willing to race just a few hundred yards straight ahead. Nobody would, though. Don't be foolish. I have been walking for half an hour when I see a pair of cherries on the path, but not touching it. They appear to have fallen perfectly, so that their stems are held up gently by ferns. I duck down to examine the berries and find them almost perfect, and I reach my hand to touch it when, don't pick up their gifts. Dash one of the warnings I've heard all my life rings clearly in my head. Are these fruit really a gift, though? There are certainly cherry trees in these woods, and though I can't see any right now, that doesn't mean that there are none close enough for this to be a natural occurrence. I eat the berries and continue on my way. In our village, adults tell children what to do in the woods before they are old enough to venture out there. Before they're even old enough to walk, in some cases. If you take their gifts, listen to the whispers in the forest, insult them, or leave the trail for any reason, then you could be taken. Some children who are taken are replaced by false, corrupted versions. Some are merely removed, never to be seen again. They never replace the adults. As a teenager teetering between childhood and adulthood, I wonder whether their rules would allow them to send a replica back in my stead. I wonder if they would even want to. The whisper started up a few minutes later. I can't remember if they alarmed me the first time, but I've been on this trail many times before today. The whispers are not things that we should listen to, but despite that, or perhaps more likely because of that, they're beautifully melodic. I've heard riddles, insults, and compliments over the years, each one in a compellingly sweet tone. I've walked these paths so many times that by all rights I shouldn't have tripped. But whether due to them or my own poor coordination, I fall hard and slide down the slope to the left of the track. No matter how you look at it, I'm definitely off the path now. I hear giggling all around, though I can't see a single source. Oh yeah, you think you're funny. You really think you're clever? Your tricks are stupid, and you're stupid, and you just dash. The trees creak, and I feel the pressure in the air change. The light shifts, and I hear a cracking noise behind me. I spin round, and I see her. Beautiful, horrific, and altogether inhuman. I sob as I fall to her feet. I didn't mean it. I whisper. I didn't mean it. It was just the last rule that I had not broken. I haven't been honest with you, I suppose. Not entirely. I told you of the rules that adults tell children in these parts, and I let you believe that I was told these myself, rather than only ever hearing them from parents who were actually concerned about their kids. I told you how I ate the berries and left off just how much I hoped they were a gift. That I tripped was perfectly true, but the additional truth that I had fully intended to purposefully leave the path at a later point would have shifted the tone somewhat. Why did you come? She asked me. Whilst parents told their children the rules of the woods, what mother, who truly cared about their child's safety, would not only fail to catch them, but actively allow their child to walk this way, time and time again? My mother told me that you take people and send them back all wrong, that a good, pure child had been taken from her, and I was sent back instead. There was a pause, and I could hear creaking as she breathed. That is not the truth of the matter. I know that. I know it. I have no memories of the woods before the age of 8, and she'd already started telling this story by then. So I know it's just a story and that I didn't come from here. But this is still where I want to be. I'd stop crying, perhaps because there was no longer any point. I'd made my case, and she would either choose to accept me or she wouldn't. This choice cannot be undone, and our ways are not like the ones you've known. We are not what you might consider kind. I shrugged. Neither were they. All children learn the rules of the woods, but so too do all adults. They take alarming truths and flavor them with suspicion and fear. They use stories of the forest to hide truths from inside the village in a place that no neighbor will dare to scrutinize too carefully. It is true that the beings in the forest will steal those who break their simple rules. But it is also true that sometimes, every so often, there are those of us who want to be stolen. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comment section and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.